All right. Well, let's jump into it. Thanks for everybody for joining. We got a lot of late additions to the list, so excited to have you all here. So I'm Matt Vanderbrook. I am the director of commercial origination at GreenSpark Solar. So I oversee all of our sort of front end sales and development for our commercial team, with a particular focus on our what we call greenfield development or land hosting development that we do across New York State. And so we'll sort of get into the details. This is sort of a new thing for us to do. We do a lot of webinars, but we haven't really done like one like this around land hosting and sort of how we develop solar projects on land throughout New York, including farmland, and sort of how the benefits of that are going to work. So I know we got a lot of great questions from folks already that we'll answer throughout this, and then we'll have another slide that answers some of the questions that came in. But feel free to send any messages in the chat, and then our team here will get those questions over to me, and I can answer them as we're going through this. Yeah, so we'll get going. So we just want to start out talking a little bit about GreenSpark. So for those who haven't heard of us, we're a over 20-year-old business that started sort of in the wind industry and a different setting, and then switched over to solar around 2011. And so we're based just outside of Rochester. We are, as you can see in this picture, we've done a ton of growth in the last 3 or 4 years, based around a lot of different factors, but have become one of the largest solar companies and solar installers in across New York State. We're up to about 140 employees, and that's split between our residential team, our commercial construction team, our sort of in-house development teams. There's a lot of different aspects of the business, and so we're seeing a lot of growth and continuing to see that growth based on the support from policies at the federal government, state level, and just sort of increases in electricity costs and that everybody's been experiencing. So just some more details on GreenSpark. Like I said, we're based in Rochester. We were last year named the fastest growing company in the greater Rochester area. So we've had a lot of successes to our name in the last couple of years. Probably most importantly, we are a B Corporation. For those who don't know, a B Corporation is an independent certification process that we have to go through every 2 or 3 years, based on a number of different factors. So not just profit driven, but also the benefits that and the initiatives that we have to support our employees, our planet, and our community. So that's a very important part of our company, and something we've been has been part of our company for close to a decade now, and sort of ties in closely with what we're talking about here. Is like, we want to be responsible developers throughout New York State and work closely with communities when we can, and work with the landowners and sort of provide opportunities that are beneficial to everyone for these projects. Like I mentioned, we've installed over 340 megawatts of solar. That's between residential or rooftop business and our larger scale ground mount projects. And we're a member of the Amicus Solar Cooperative, which is a national buying cooperative of similar companies, over 70 to date, that pool a lot of resources, share a lot of knowledge. Great group to be a part of. And then again, sort of as I referenced, a lot of what's driving a lot of our growth and the growth of the solar industry are a lot of the New York State's climate goals. New York State has set a goal to have 70% of all of our electricity sourced from renewables. That's solar, wind, hydro, by 2030. 100% all electric passenger vehicles sold by 2035. 100% zero emissions in new building construction by 2027, and 100% emissions-free electricity by 2040. So really ambitious goals, some of the most ambitious in the country, which has led to a lot of the growth that we're seeing as a company, and really growth around the whole renewable energy, clean energy economy in New York State. Okay, so hosting solar on land. So this is really meant to be an overview of what that looks like, some of the reasons, why we structure it the way we do, and just an open forum to just kind of answer people's questions and talk through this. So just, I think I'll zoom out a little bit to sort of what the drive is for a lot of this, right? So New York State has set these ambitious climate goals. One of the ways to do that is to build, solar projects. Um, Ground mount solar is impactful and is sort of the most financially viable way to do that, just because, right, you get the economies of scale of building a larger scale solar project. And you can sort of take advantage of some of the tax credits that exist, the incentives that exist. And when you're building a larger scale system, right, you're sort of driving down the costs to build because, right, you're buying a lot of steel and you're getting, you're bulk purchasing a lot of steel, or you're bulk purchasing a lot of modules that are allow you to kind of get to drive those costs down and get it to a point where it's, financially viable, and we can, we can build the project. So in New York State, one of the funding program that supports that is New York Sun Initiative. So that provides some level of incentive to support these larger scale ground mount systems. It's important to note, sort of in all of this, is that there's distributed solar and there's utility scale solar. So distribution scale solar is what we operate in. So those are smaller scale projects, right, that are tying in directly to a distribution circuit. So you look out your window, you have utility poles. It's most likely going to be a distribution level circuit. That's where we're feeding our projects into. Transmission level is, really getting into, the really tall, 115 kV lines that, run through certain areas of our state that are, 50, 60, 70 feet tall. Utility scale feeds into those. You have to build a dedicated substation similar to any sort of large scale generating plant, large wind farms. That energy goes into those facilities. Again, it sort of is location dependent, right? Like for transmission level, you're going to want to be close to those transmission lines to be able to supply the power there. Similar with distribution level, we need to tie into distribution circuits that can handle the load that we're generating from our system. And there's a lot of other factors that go into that, but really the point there is, like, these projects cannot go anywhere. There are very specific criteria to where you can site these projects, right? It's proximity to those distribution circuits, to three-phase lines. And mostly what's happened in New York State in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been so much growth. I'm sure a lot of people have seen so many more solar panels going up. There's a limit to what you can put on any given substation in New York State, right? So more rural areas of New York have smaller substations or have sort of limited capacity on the substation because there's not as much load in those areas. A lot of those areas have already sort of been developed and solar projects have been built, and there's probably limited capacity for what they can do. What's happening now is the focus is and certainly this isn't in every case, but a lot of the focus is moving closer towards, the more populated areas to the more urban centers, because that's where there's still capacity available to be able to put these systems online. And based on the goals that have been laid out by the state, there needs to be more solar built, right? But there's limitations to what we can do in more rural areas. So that's why we're looking at these other things. Bit of a tangent there. So yeah, and again, if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. With GreenSpark, and sort of because we're B Corp and because we want to be, good neighbors and supportive of the community, we look at, and again, farmland is not, we do not exclusively look at farmland for these projects. It just so happens that's a lot of the times, when we do some outreach into a community, that's oftentimes where we're getting the feedback, right, is from farmland. So in light of that, we follow the smart solar principles from the American Farmland Trust. Basically it's protecting the soil as best we can. It's integrating, we have a picture there of sheep, grazing within the array itself. You can actually have sheep in to graze and sort of use that as an alternative to mow. And, planting pollinators, or not sort of stripping all the land down, right? There's a lot of different elements of that we incorporate in our projects, again, to be good stewards of the earth and good neighbors. As part of that process, right, we work closely with the landowner to understand, where is your preferred location for this, right? And sometimes we don't always have the flexibility, right? It does depend on where we can interconnect, or sort of what the town allows us to do based on their permitting requirements. But, we've had projects where we work with the landowner and they say, hey, this is my least productive piece of land, or this is a piece of land that I, don't, isn't as valuable to me. Can we explore that? And we will go into that detail to figure out, can we utilize this, maybe less valuable piece of property? And if not, maybe the landowner decides, look, like I don't want to use this other piece of land, and that's okay. And we can sort of, part ways after that point. But really, at the end of the day, we want to find that land that is, is able to support the landowner with not only income from their agricultural operation, however that comes in, but also provide this sort of supplemental income from the solar projects. So sort of getting the best of both worlds, the best that we can. So here's why people would consider hosting a solar project on their property. As I mentioned, right, it's passive income, it's lower risk, right? From that standpoint, right? We're not asking any of our landowners to make significant investments. There might be some money that's required to pay some lawyers to review leases, but ultimately we're the ones responsible for all the costs of development, design, construction, operation of the system. In exchange for that, of sort of being able to build the solar on your property, we're signing a lease agreement with you, and we're paying you a per acre amount to host the land on our solar. And we'll get into the details of what those looks like. Other things, the bullet here of create long-term farm viability with diversified investments. So I'll use an example. We have a number of projects that we're doing in the town of Henrietta coming up. The town's approach to solar is somewhat unique in that they see solar as a way to actually provide benefits and sort of long-term stability to farms, because we can sort of, and they encourage sort of, you're going to site solar on a piece of farmland, and then there's going to be a sort of a way to protect the rest of the farmland so that it remains farmland, right? So it's providing that additional income so that a farmer or a family doesn't have to decide between keeping their farm and doing something else with it, whether it's selling it or providing some other sort of residential development, whatever that may be. So it is a way to, in many cases, that you can sort of preserve the long-term stability and sort of operation of the farm. And sort of a lot of the people that we have worked with have talked about the ability to provide income to sort of, to family, right? To say, here's this lease agreement, which is 25 upwards of 40 years of lease income that comes in to provide, additional revenue and stability to your family. And, leave a legacy that, will provide those benefits to them. Support community with clean local energy, right? Like we are, as part of our projects, we are doing a number of upgrades to the distribution circuits. We have to pay the utilities to interconnect our system, which usually requires upgrades to substations. It requires upgrades to the lines that are coming into the facility. So we're actually providing some additional infrastructure as part of this. And like I mentioned, it's the opportunity for next generation ownership. Okay, so here's what we look for in a project. Again, there's a lot of different variables. Things can get, you can really get into the weeds on this. Generally speaking, 20 or more acres of property, right? Our projects range in size from 10 to 20 to 30 acres, depending on a lot of different aspects. Generally, we felt that you would need at least 20 acres of land to be able to meet the setback requirements from the town and to sort of be able to host the size of system and provide flexibility and sort of we can do it. the more than 20, the better, right? Like 20 is sort of probably the absolute minimum. I would say most of the projects that we're doing, people are in the 40, 50, 60 acre range. And again, that's giving you some more flexibility around siting and, working through the permitting requirements from the town, making sure your, proper setbacks are in place. Three-phase power. So this one is simple. If you look out your window and you see 3 lines on top of a utility pole, that's three-phase power. That is not an absolute necessity at a site, right? Like it just needs to be close by. We've the number of projects where three-phase might be, a couple thousand feet away. We have to run an extension of the line to our project. Usually it's costs something, but it's not sort of a red flag or a deal breaker by any means. But generally speaking, we need three-phase power in close proximity because that's the circuit that we can tie this project to. It's at the kilovoltage that we can actually interconnect the system at. What makes land a good site for solar? A supportive solar code. This is probably, New York's a home rule state. Every town, village has their own permitting and code requirements. A lot of them have solar codes. A lot of them don't. Some of them are restrictive. Some of them are not. So it's working, at an early stage, we do an evaluation of it. And then, if the project is sort of advancing and the interconnection looks promising, we can really dive into the details and figure out, what do we have to do to get this project approved from the town? Or are there too many restrictions and it's actually not going to happen, right? And so that's a lot of what we deal with is sort of reviewing those codes and seeing what they look like. We do work with towns to help sort of set up, provide them input on setting up solar codes that are fair. We're not interested in just sort of steamrolling and just saying we should be able to put these wherever we want. But we also want it to be, the state has set out these requirements to meet these goals. And there are certain spots of New York State where there is still capacity and, the code may not allow for it. So, finding those locations that have codes that we can sort of work with projects and find locations that are going to be viable is a big part of this. And then as I mentioned, sort of the interconnection queue at the top, right? That is the first thing that we look at on any site, right? I guess other than acreage is, what does the interconnection capacity look like? Are there other projects already on the queue ahead of us, or is that substation completely maxed out? Or is there still capacity available? And that's sort of where you get really into the weeds of, you can put it at this location and you could go, 2 miles down the road and you can absolutely not do it there. I see I got a chat. I'm just going to answer it. From Peter. Have you considered creating mini grids, constructing appropriately sized solar to power the local community? Such a configuration would truly be community oriented rather than continuing reliance on existing power grid. This would also provide. It's a great question, Peter, and I know this certainly exists in a number of places. I think the challenge with all of the projects that we build are in the IOUs, which are the investor-owned utilities. So that's NYSEG, National Grid, RG&E, and then through the rest of the state, it's Orange and Rockland, Central Hudson, and Con Ed. So those utilities, they control those networks, right? They're the ones that own all of those lines. To be able to build something like that you were discussing, right? It would require taking ownership of those. So there are municipal electric cooperatives. Spencerport is in one, Fairport Municipal Electric. So there's a number of those, and they sort of control that network, right? They own the infrastructure and are able to sort of produce something like that. But I think the neighborhood grid idea is something that we're seeing more on. We have a team of folks at GreenSpark that are looking sort of at the next stages of, what these project structures look like. And that's certainly a contemplation of how that would work. And I think, in the long term, there's a lot of benefits to exploring projects like that. So great question. So here's where we get down to the numbers. So our lease rates for our projects generally range about $1,500 to $2,000 per acre. We like to give a range just because at an early stage of an assessment, we just don't know. Like there's a lot of things that have to be understood. And really one of the big determining factors, as I mentioned, is the utility upgrades, right? We are going to pay some amount of money to the utility to upgrade their infrastructure to accept the generation from our system. Sometimes those come back and they're, $300,000 or $400,000, and that's good. We can work with that. And sometimes they come back and they're 15 to 20 to $30 million. That's not so good. So that's really the conclusion of that process, which can take, many months to understand sort of exactly what that's going to look like. That has a big impact sort of on what we can afford in our project. And generally speaking, $2,000 is like, you got a site that's pretty easy to build. There's not a lot of civil requirements, and the interconnection is really good. As you sort of add additional complexities, that's sort of we get lower in that range. But I think what we found is that $1,500 is sort of kind of the baseline starting point at the market today. So what happens? This question has come up a lot, comes up all the time. What happens at the end, right? You have a 25-year or 40-year agreement. That's just sort of the typical lease that is employed for these, just to kind of that's what maximizes the financial return on them. And also 25 years is the warranted production life of the solar panels. They will continue operating after that point, but that's sort of, if it's not producing at 85% of what it originally was in year 21, you can go back to the manufacturer and say, hey, you owe me some new modules. So at the end of the term, right, is what we call decommissioning. So in our leases that we sign, there's a decommissioning clause, right? So even during if the system is not operational for a certain period of time, it's like 180 days or 210 days, the owner of the system has to remove it, unlikely that that's going to happen, right? Because that's, once it's installed, sort of most of the money's been expended, and like you're just sort of making money off of the energy generation at that point. But that clause is built in the lease that like, if it's not up and running, we can't just leave it there to rust. Like we have to remove it. At the end of the term, same deal applies, right? The system's no longer running. The lease is expired. We have to go in and remove it. We build those costs into our model. There's a decommissioning bond is sort of becoming a more standardized approach to deal with that. And in most cases, towns now require a decommissioning bond where we have to every year put money into a fund that if something happens and the system's not running, the town can sort of have the money to be able to pay for its removal at that point. And last point there is just land hosts have no operations or maintenance obligations, right? GreenSpark is we're a developer, we're a builder, we're a contractor, and we also are a service provider. So we maintain and monitor the systems after they've been constructed. And so we're required to handle all of the maintenance at the site and all of that. So, and then we do have a lease signing bonus. So like if someone signs up, they sign a lease with us. Once we sort of understand the interconnection, there's a signing bonus as well as that. I'm going to jump a couple of questions through the chat. So I'm going to just jump back there and answer them while we're going here. Steuben Rural Electric is our power company. Do you work with them? Yeah, so that goes back to the investor-owned utilities. So Steuben Rural Electric is not subject to the same rules that the IOUs are, right? So there's a couple of different things that they're not required to do. There's a customer systems benefit charge, systems benefit fund that all the IOUs, investor-owned utilities, pay into. Groups like the Steuben Rural Electric Cooperative or Village of Spencerport or Fairport Electric, they don't pay into that. But as part of that, they don't really get the other incentives that are available, and they are not governed by the standard interconnection processes in New York State, right? They sort of operate independently of that. So we're not sort of allowed to do all the same things we can do in other places, right? We don't have a standard way to submit interconnection and to get that process reviewed. We don't have a standardized process to how much those costs are going to be. And there's not really other incentives available at the state level just because they're not in that segment. Now, that doesn't mean that those that those projects can't happen in those areas. They just have to happen in a different way, and they really have to be led by, in this case, Steuben Rural Electric. They really have to be led by that entity, right? Like Steuben Rural Electric buys electricity, right? They buy it from the day-ahead wholesale market, and they supply it to their customers. They could install solar and sort of reduce the amount that they have to purchase because they're delivering solar to their community. That's something that we haven't seen too much of in New York. There's other states where that does happen, but really it would be a different process for a group like that. And so right now there really wouldn't be any way for us to lease land in those areas because of that, right? Like again, that could change. The Steuben Rural Electric could decide that they want to pursue something like that. That would certainly make that advantageous. But right now, we don't really have a clear path on how that would work. Next question from David: Are you interested in clearing overgrown wooded areas? Is the first question. Yeah, I mean, we do. I mean, we are an environmentally focused company. If we don't have to clear trees, we don't want to, but certainly there are situations where we do clear trees out. And I think it comes down to like what's the, if you might be in an area where the interconnection viability is so valuable that it makes sense to do that. And so we have had scenarios where we would clean trees. It's not something we probably would have done 3 or 4 years ago, but just based on sort of the limited, as the available land area for doing these projects has gotten smaller, that has made those overgrown wooded areas more feasible, I guess I would say. So it's certainly something we could look at. And what if you go out of business during the lease? Yeah, so sort of that goes back to that decommissioning bond, right? So if something happened, I mean, most likely, if this scenario where we or a project owner for any project went out of business, that asset could be sold off, right? That still has value. It would be sort of any eventual sale, right? That probably would create more concerns because like, who is this entity buying it? But there certainly is value, and they would be, whoever took ownership of their assets would still sort of be subject to the terms of the lease. So even if they said, well, we don't want it anymore, they would still have to, it would have to be removed as part of that. So, and I think that's sort of where that decommissioning bond comes in, is that like, if there isn't someone to say, hey, you got to remove this, the town has sort of a set aside amount of money. It's usually, we estimate that cost being, in the $300,000 to $400,000 range. The town would have the money to go pay someone to remove that facility and return it back to its previous state. All right. Eco-friendly practices. So I sort of mentioned, sort of the things that we like to do on our sites to be good neighbors, to be good members of the community, right? We're trying to build quality projects, because we don't build quality projects, and we have seen projects that are not sort of built to higher standards. They create issues within those communities and create sort of some of the bad feelings that people have towards solar. And so, some of the ways that we deal with that, it's the livestock, right? We've started introducing grazing on our facilities, where we're actually bringing in the sheep to graze and mow, so we're not mowing the site. Provide some additional benefit to to the community. You're paying some groups to be able to bring that, and supporting the livestock and agricultural in the area. I mentioned the pollinator habitats, right? Planting not just one monocrop of regular grass, but having different types of wildflowers or different types of grasses that can support pollinators, as well as things that the sheep will want to eat. And there's been a lot of efforts around how to do more around what's called agrivoltaics for solar, right? So you can kind of have more coexistence between producing solar energy and also producing agriculture. So NYSERDA actually has a funding program that just came out. Grant applications are due in September, where they're looking for some innovative ideas of how to do that, of how to co-locate solar and maintain sort of the agricultural aspects of the land. So that's something that we're working on, that we're going to submit some responses to, and sort of excited of where the direction's going. And then oftentimes, depending on where it is, we will be required to do screening for the site, just to maintain a visual buffer from the neighbors or the roadway or whatever you're trying to block out there. And so, we will work with, we work with our engineers and landscape architects to provide suitable screening that is also, not just going to die and is not sort of a bunch of pine trees in a line, right? To have a little more thoughtfulness around how you're designing that. Yeah, so I think the concept of, preserving farmland, I sort of mentioned at the beginning, right? Of like why we look at it that way, right? We've seen it because we've had customers that have done it, that we're saying, look, we're providing you some additional income on your property that can allow you to continue to, farm or however you want to use the rest of your land, right? Like, because we have limitations from the towns and sort of how much we can actually build, right? The limit, a single one of these projects cannot be bigger than 5 megawatts, which is about 25 acres. We can co-locate and build multiple ones, and we've done that before, but those opportunities are, somewhat limited in many cases. So oftentimes, 20 to 25 acres is sort of the max. So if you have, 75, 100 acres of land, we don't need all that land. We just need a portion of it, and you can continue to use it the other way. So this sort of just walks through kind of what our process is, right? Like the first thing, if someone says we would be interested in hosting solar, we would have that conversation, get some more information from you, address, just any other details that you might want to share about the project. And then we evaluate the publicly available information from the utilities on, can we interconnect it? Does it look like there's capacity? And what the local codes say. If we determine that it's viable, and again, the majority a lot of people that come in the door are just not viable because of those reasons. But if it does look good, we proceed with a letter of intent and an owner consent to file with the utility. The letter of intent lays out the general terms of what the lease would look like. It's not the actual lease. And then the property owner consent is a letter that the utilities require that we submit to demonstrate that your multiple different companies are not applying on the same piece of property. So once we get that information, we can do our preliminary design and submit to the utility for their initial review. That process, there's a couple different phases of it, but that process can take anywhere from 6 to 9 months. The conclusion of that process is they're going to tell us, yes, you can interconnect it, and it's going to cost this much, or they're going to say, yes, you can interconnect it, and it's going to cost way more than you can actually pay. And then sort of in an early stage, we sort of get a general sense of, if this is going to be promising, and then we kind of dive into the more formal permitting process, the site review, environmental reviews, survey work, all that stuff can kind of happen in parallel. So now we just got some case studies. I won't read the quote. This is one of my favorites. This is a project we did in the town of Ontario with John and Jim Schreiber, who have owned this land and farmed it for many years. So we built this system. Their property, if you sort of look at that image, extends all the way to that furthest tree line. So again, we're not using all of their property. We couldn't, for a variety of reasons. There was a limit to how much we could put on the grid, and the town had some requirements for setbacks that kept it. So this footprint of that project is somewhere around, I think it's around 12 acres, as I recall. And so that system, which went online 2-3 years ago at this point, right? It's providing that income to the Schreibers, allowing them to continue ownership of that property and sort of pass that along to their kids. And at the same time, it's also providing energy to home leasing. So home leasing is the actual project owner for that. Home leasing is an affordable housing developer based here in Rochester, and they use the electricity generated from that system to offset their facilities around really the RG&E territory where they have facilities. So yeah, so in just the project structure, right? I sort of touched on this. Uh-oh, after my video. Here we go. All right, sorry, technical difficulties. Hold on one sec. I'll bring it back up. Okay. So we touched on the project structure a little bit already, right? That was, the land host. We are the developer and builder. The project owner is usually determined later on, right? Like in the future, GreenSpark is intended to be the project owner, but we work with very select project financiers to sort of provide the financial backing for those projects, and ultimately are the ones that own it. But we remain sort of the main point of contact. We are the contractor that built it, and we're the one that monitors and maintains it. So it's, our involvement in these projects is sort of from beginning to end. Just another quote from John Schreiber here on his land, sort of why he worked with us. And again, John's a great guy, very, very supportive of GreenSpark, to the point where he actually installed solar on his house after we had this go up. So, yeah, so I would imagine that a lot of people on the call have gotten a lot of mailers, have gotten contacted previously from other solar companies. There's a lot of them. Not all of them operate in the same way that we do. Doesn't mean it's not wrong. It's just that we do things a little bit differently. So like I said, we are sort of soup to nuts. Like, we're there at the early stage to sort of assess the project. We're there through the design, the development, the permitting, and the construction, right? Oftentimes companies are maybe just focusing on one of those things. Maybe it's just a developer and they're just sort of getting to the point where they've developed it and they can sell it to someone else, and a different company is going to come in to sort of finish the remaining tasks, and there's going to be a handoff. And other companies are just builders, and they're sort of brought in later stage, which we also, we have a whole separate arm of the company that just builds projects for other people. So, but yeah, we are a New York headquartered company. We are, focused on making New York, the New York market strong, and focused on doing what's best for our community, right? We've been in business for over 22 years. We're not planning on going anywhere. So, yeah, it's a very, our focus is this area. Customer centric, we try to be as transparent with our communication as possible, provide as many frequent updates as we can on how the project's going, and be responsive to, the landowner and all the different stakeholders, right? We have this approach to these projects is that, everybody needs to get some benefit out of it, right? Like, one entity can't sort of get all the benefit while others deal with other burdens of it. So it's like, we have to sort of thread the needle of, we have to provide the income necessary to the landowner to want to do this. We have to provide, the financial benefit to us and our project owner to, make that investment. It's an investment. It needs to make money and sort of meet the financial requirements. We need to work with the town and sort of make sure that we're working within all of their within their guidelines, and providing a project that is not going to cause a lot of concerns or issues within the community. And also, working with the utility where, we're putting generation on their system and sort of offsetting their need to put in new generation elsewhere, or purchase energy from other states or from neighboring places as well. So, we're going to jump into some more of these questions, but I'll open up the chat. I'll start with those first. So Royce asked, do land taxes increase if solar is on it? Great question. So, the setup is it is somewhat specific as to what town you're in, right? The assessors have different ways to interpret this. Generally speaking, how this works is, we are responsible for the taxes associated with the solar project, right? So you're putting in, a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment. There's going to be some taxes around it. That's our responsibility in our project, and we have to factor those into our costs. So typically how it's worked in most places, again, not all, we sign a pilot agreement. So a pilot is a payment in lieu of taxes. So we'll work with the town, the county, and the school district in some form or fashion, and we'll agree to pay them a certain dollar amount every single year for 15 years for the project, in lieu of them sort of saying, okay, we're going to hit you with the full freight. You're going to have to pay us, $500,000 every single year. The projects just wouldn't happen. And so these payment in lieu of taxes are ways to kind of spread out the cost throughout sort of the lifetime of the system, while also, paying into supporting, the schools, the counties, and all that. How that impacts the landowner, again, depends on the assessor. We factor into our lease that, like, if there is an increase in taxes that is attributable to the solar, that's our responsibility. Oftentimes an assessor will just carve out the property that the solar's on. You'll actually have like a sub parcel, and they'll just tax that parcel, and it won't really impact the landowner. There's certainly scenarios where it may not play out exactly that way, but that's something we sort of get into and can sort of negotiate around as it happens. Will recording be made available? Yes. We'll follow up with the recording, with a link to the recording for everybody as well. Are you able to connect the NICEX high tension power lines if your output is big enough? Yes. So at the beginning, I was sort of just talking about the difference between utility scale and distribution scale projects. So we operate in the distribution scale world. So we're tying into the local distribution networks. Utility scale ties into those NICEX high tension power lines, right? You're building to do that. You essentially have to build a substation. Substations are, can't just buy them off the shelf. You're talking about 30, 40, $50 million costs. So you have to build the project large enough to be able to absorb those costs. And that's why you see there's certainly a couple that are up and running or operational. There's some in Rush and down into Mount Morris. I think there's some planned out in like Orleans County as well. So those are projects that are going into the high tension power lines. Those projects, the value of that electricity is structured a lot different, right? Like you're selling it at wholesale, you're selling it at whatever the market value is at that given time. And usually it's, it could be on a hot day, it might be 10, 11, 12 cents. On some day in April, it might be 1 or 2 cents, right? So, it really is you're getting a little less value. So it really does require that larger scale project to make work. And you're talking about projects that are covering hundreds and hundreds of acres. Again, a few have gone in. It seems like there's been some roadblocks that have come up that have slowed that process down quite a bit. So again, we are just focused on the distribution scale at the moment. So some more questions here. Minimum acreage requirement. I mentioned, 20 acres is really the bare minimum. That's if you're under 20 acres, it's really difficult to find the necessary land to make the project and the economics work. The more the better. Helps us site and find sort of the right locations there. Is there any damage caused to the land? So, I mean, it's a construction project, right? During the construction project, there's going to be equipment on the site. There's going to be, tractors. There's going to be drill rigs that are hammering things into the ground. Like there's going to be impacts. You can't dance around it, right? For 3 to 6 months of this project, it's a full-blown construction site. Once it's done, right, like that's sort of when we get in to do the restoration and all of the seeding, the planting, and clean it up, clean it all up so it's not a mud pit. The permanence of the structure installation. So in our decommissioning, like this is where, and we outline it in great detail of how that works. Like we're required to remove everything, like the wires, the modules, the racking, the steel that's in the ground. We have to dig down and cut it. So there may still be some of that steel deeper down. And in farming, like knowing the depth of those things is pretty important. So it's pretty deep down that we have to literally dig it out, cut it, and then cover it back up. So the the way these are structured and the way the towns are requiring us to deal with them is like we have to remove it and return it back to as close to its original state as possible. So, and, the projects that, the oldest projects that have been up and running in New York are, probably approaching 10 years old at this point. So they have another 10 to 20 years before they're going to be sort of not functioning. And even at that point, they might be repowered. There might be some different ways. So there's still some time to figure out sort of how that's all going to play out. Do agricultural exemptions apply for tax purposes? So similar, kind of back to that taxing question. Typically, and we certainly would like to change this, but New York State Ag and Markets does not consider a solar. Basically, you lose your agricultural exemption on that property that the solar is going on. So how we've dealt with that in the past, like if you were in an ag exemption, right, if you remove it, there's a penalty. We've paid the penalty in the past. It's something that we would want to look at on any specific site and sort of how to deal with that. What is the effect on my home's electric bill? Good question. Generally speaking, right, our projects, right, we're directly tying into the grid. So all of the generation is going straight onto the grid, right? From there, the New York State requires that the credits generated are allocated somewhere. And so usually what that looks like is, we might have a large off-taker, could be a school, could be a hospital, could be a private business. A lot of different ways to do it. It could also be a community solar project, right? Where there's multiple residential customers that sign up for it and get the benefits of it. So, an individual homeowner, there could be an impact if the project is sort of set up with the right structure. Right. So if it is a community solar project, you could get the credits generated from that system applied to your bills. So that's certainly something that can be considered on any of these projects and how to do that. Certainly something we can evaluate. Will adding solar to my land impact my property value? And if so, by how much? So this is a good question. There's been some literature around it that it doesn't really impact the property value, right? Like I think people are concerned, oh, well, you're putting this on, it's going to lower the property value. The literature out there doesn't suggest that is actually the case. And as I mentioned, the taxing jurisdiction is likely going to kind of parcel out that property that has solar on it, so it won't impact the property that you continue to own and operate on, right? And again, it is very specific to the assessor you're working with, and that's something we, as we work through a process, something we have to work with the landowners and the towns to understand how exactly that's going to apply, and sort of if there's ways to work around it or ways to find some collaboration for solutions, we will do that. How do solar farms mesh with local zoning, planning, and NYSERDA's model solar law? Yeah, depends. Depends. Right. Every town is different. Every town has different requirements. Some towns have very well structured codes that are very clear as to what we can do and where we can. And other places you go, they don't even touch it, and we have to sort of work our way through that procedure with them. Again, it's site specific. And then NYSERDA's model solar law. Yeah, I mean, the model solar law is sort of what NYSERDA suggests that towns, sort of an example for towns to consider, right? Say, here's a model solar law you could consider when you're structuring this. Every town, like I said, everybody does it a little bit differently. It depends on all of those different factors of, where they want to allow it and where they don't want to allow it, right? Henrietta, their code allows it in agriculturally zoned areas because that's where they think it should go, because that's where they think the benefits are. Other towns, you are not allowed to put it in agricultural areas, right? So it's just stuff we have to work through for each given project. What chemicals are used? Is there any lasting impact to soil land once structure is removed? So, in the the solar farm itself, like it's steel, it's copper. There's certainly some, different maybe oils and coolants that go into the transformers. The solar modules themselves, I mean, they do have some metals in it. Like there is some lead in them. Uh, but it's pretty minor. It's just for sort of, fusing the cells together in many ways. So it's fairly limited. And with the solar panels themselves, right, they're protected and they're encased in glass, right? So unless they break, there's not really any sort of other way that any of the metals in there that would get into it. And if they do break, like, we are aware of it and we go and replace them. We have no incentive to leave broken solar panels out there. So we go and replace them. And we are, solar, recycling is picking up, and there's a lot more of that opportunity. It's still something that we're still, we do recycle our panels, but there needs to be sort of a larger industry-wide solution to come up to work through those. Lasting impact to soil, land once structure removed. I mean, again, like, we're just putting steel in the ground. I don't really know exactly what the long-term impacts of having steel in the ground are. I mean, the one thing I'll say is, like, there's not really anything else happening on that land, right? You're not, you're sort of not planting crops there, or sort of using up the nutrients in the land. So to some extent, you might be able to argue that it's providing some benefits to the soil, but I think there's still some research that we need to figure out on that. How tall are posts that hold up the solar panels? So generally speaking, and we sort of work with couple different technologies, but a lot of the systems we're doing now are trackers, so they actually track the sun throughout the day. And those are generally on posts that are somewhere in the 8 to 9 to 10 foot range. They can be taller when the modules are vertical. So you might be in sort of 10, 15 foot. Again, there are restrictions around heights. Oftentimes we have to work with the town to understand that. The posts themselves will go into the ground fairly far, right? If they can, we're talking like 10, 12 feet down into the ground. So they're pretty big. Can land underneath be used for crops or grazing? This sort of, we talk about the agrivoltaics. To some extent, they can be, I mean, they absolutely can be used for grazing. We are doing that now. The crops is a bit of a different question. I think that's one of the things with this agrivoltaics that we're trying to figure out. But that does happen, right? It does happen that people are able to plant under those areas in certain scenarios. Not something that we've had much experience with on any of our projects. And the last one here, and I'll jump to the others on the chat, is if there is a waiting period, what is the payment for those years? Right. So the typical process, like, before it would somewhere between 2 and 3 years before a system would be operational, right? That's the development process plus the construction process plus working through the utility and the permitting requirements. 2 to 3 years. In that time, once we sign a lease, which usually happens, a little further into that, maybe 6 months in, there's a bonus payment, which we have to sort of, to kind of say, hey, you're signing this lease, here's a bonus payment. From there, the lease payments would start when construction begins. So you might be looking at, you could be looking at a year or so. And we can sort of get creative and do some other things if that's, if folks are looking for different payments in that time to sort of, reserve the project. And I'll hit a couple more chance. What is the minimum depth of mounting posts would be cut off underground? That's a good question. Generally, I believe it's a couple feet down. But again, it does depend on the requirements, and that would be, I don't have that answer right off the top of my head, but it is meant to be pretty deep, right? To avoid, so that you're not digging that up when someone's plowing the field later on, is to get those cut pretty far down. Have there been any issues with stray voltage on solar projects? No. I mean, it's like any sort of large, electrical system. There's certainly, you wouldn't want to go up to the transformer and open the door and put your hands in there. But stray voltage is not something that I've ever seen any sort of issues around our projects, right? So I'm sure there's some additional research out there, but it's not something I've ever had any experience with, and certainly something we can kind of dig more into the details, but not something that we've dealt with as an issue on any of our projects. Lightning strikes. Yeah, so these are all fully grounded, right? Like lightning strikes happen. We have to put in copper throughout the ground to deal with those lightning strikes if they do happen. And again, there's protections in the system. If something happens, it will shut down. If there's a major, power surge or anything like that. I mean, we've had projects that have been struck by lightning, and it does, it's something we have to go maintain and deal with, but it's not sort of a, you know, not some massive risk to doing these projects. So yeah, I think we're almost at time here. So very happy to talk with everybody on this. We're going to follow up with some more details on the recording for everyone, and yeah, would love to take a look at your property and see. Oh, I got one more question: safety issues relative to cracked, broken panels and electrocution. Yeah, I mean, we have a fully trained staff that are trained to handle these systems. If panels, the area is fenced in, right? It's has to be surrounded by a fence so that people can't just wander in there. And if there's an emergency situation, there's a shutdown that you can just turn the system off so that there's not going to be a major electrical issue and the system's not operating, right? Like in the worst case scenario, there's, a lightning strike and a fire or something. Like we have protections that you can go in and just shut the system down physically outside of it to make sure that, there's not going to be any sort of electric charges and any risk of electrocution there. So, um, but yeah, so again, appreciate everyone's time. Please, we'll follow up with more details. If it's something that you're considering, please let us know, and we'll take a look at the evaluation. And if other questions come along, please feel free to reach out. And again, thanks for everyone's time today. And hopefully we'll be hearing from you all soon. Thanks, everyone.